June 13th, 2001. Dallas, Texas. 51-year-old teacher Sharon Davis drops her daughter off at a bus depot, but fails to show up for a scheduled training session at her school that morning. 5 days later, Sharon's abandoned minivan is discovered in the parking lot of a local fitness club. Suspicion turns towards Sharon's estranged husband, Ron Davis, as Sharon had filed for divorce from him only 2 days before she disappeared. Ron maintains his innocence and claims that Sharon stole money from him and took off on her own, but no trace of her is ever found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and we've got an unsolved missing persons case to cover today, the 2001 disappearance of Sharon Davis. Now this one is pretty unique for a number of reasons. As you probably know, this podcast has gone out of its way to cover lesser-known cases which were featured on Unsolved Mysteries, but only aired on television once, or a handful of times. In fact, I've even discussed a few cold cases which came close to being featured on the show, but never came to fruition. However, in this case, Unsolved Mysteries actually went to the trouble of filming and producing an entire segment, but for various reasons, including an angry letter from the victim's husband, the segment never aired. So as far as I know, it has remained in a vault and not seen the light of day for nearly 20 years. The victim in question was a wife and mother named Sharon Davis, who vanished without explanation, and as you might have already guessed, most of the suspicion would be directed towards her husband, as the marriage was not a happy one, and Sharon had taken the major step of filing for divorce only days before she went missing. Unfortunately, it seems like Unsolved Mysteries' decision to not air this case really put a monkey wrench into the attempts to get it some attention. The primary sources I could find for this episode are Sharon Davis's profile page on the Charlie Project and a couple of extensive articles written in the Dallas Observer by Thomas Korosek in 2002 and 2003. But from what I can tell, media coverage of Sharon's disappearance has been virtually non-existent since then, and I really hope that's not due to the fact that she was African American. All we know is that Sharon is still a missing person after all these years, so we are going to explore her disappearance on today's episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the unsolved disappearance of Sharon Davis. Our story begins in Dallas, Texas in 2001. Our central figure is 51-year-old Sharon Eugenia Davis, who lives with her 53-year-old husband, Ron Davis, in a suburban neighborhood on Elderleaf Drive. The couple have been married for 21 years and originally met while they were living in Los Angeles. Even though she was born in Alabama, Sharon had moved to LA when she was a child and went on to earn a master's degree in public administration from California State University. Ron originally hailed from Wisconsin, and at the time he met Sharon, he was a recent divorcee with a daughter from his previous marriage. Shortly after Sharon and Ron got married, they decided to move to Dallas and had 2 children, a son named Ronnie and a daughter named Autumn. The couple were both employed as code enforcement officers until Sharon became a counselor who worked at multiple correctional facilities. She eventually decided to go into teaching and currently teaches 3rd grade at Stemmons Elementary School. At this particular point in time, both of Sharon's children are students at the University of Texas at Arlington, with Ronnie living on campus and Autumn still living at home. Sharon is also attending a class there because she plans to teach 6th grade when school starts up again in the fall and is hoping to eventually become a school principal. At around 7:30 a.m. on the morning of June 13th, Sharon climbed into her 1998 Mercury Villager minivan and left her home with her daughter, who was scheduled to work her summer job that day. She drove 2 miles to the park and ride for the Redbird bus depot of the Dallas Area Rapid Transit System, aka the DART. After dropping Autumn off, Sharon was planning to return home in order to change her clothes before she attended a training session at her elementary school. However, Sharon never arrived at the session and would not be seen again. When she failed to return home by evening, Autumn became concerned and phoned her brother Ronnie. They both attempted to convince their father to call the police and report Sharon missing, but Ron told them they had to wait at least 24 hours and did not contact the authorities until the following morning. Police would conduct a search for Sharon, and on June the 18th, Her abandoned minivan was discovered in the parking lot of a Bally Total Fitness Club in the Oak Cliff neighborhood. The location was less than a mile from Sharon's home, and she was known to be a frequent patron, as records would show she visited the club about a week before she went missing. One of the van's windows was broken, and a forensic examination would reveal that it had been wiped clean of fingerprints. When employees from the fitness club were questioned, they said they first recalled seeing the minivan in the parking lot sometime after midnight on June the 14th, about 18 hours after Sharon was last seen. According to Autumn, on the night before her mother went missing, Sharon had asked her to move one of the vehicles out of the driveway because Ron had to leave for a breakfast business meeting the following morning. Autumn found this a bit odd because it was uncharacteristic for her father to conduct business during the early morning hours. But when she woke up at 6:30 a.m., she said that Ron was not at the house and never returned before her mother drove her to the bus depot. Well, Ron turned out to be very uncooperative with the authorities following Sharon's disappearance, as police tried contacting him several times to arrange an interview, but he kept avoiding them. When investigators started delving into Ron and Sharon's background, they learned their marriage had been a very troubled one. In 1985, Sharon had withdrawn money from their joint checking account and left Dallas with her 2 children. She was planning to drive to California to stay with relatives while she filed for divorce from Ron, but she changed her mind before she arrived. Sharon decided to turn around and head back to Dallas, where she reconciled with Ron before moving back in with him. But the marriage would continue to be a tumultuous one over the next several years, and according to the children, Ron was a very controlling, ill-tempered person. While they said they never saw him get physically violent, Ron was emotionally and verbally abusive towards Sharon and constantly belittled her. He demanded that Sharon pay half of their household expenses and keep her earnings in a separate account. At one point, during a family dinner, Ron got into a fight with Sharon and flat out said to her, quote, "I love my kids, I don't love you." While Sharon was well liked by everyone who knew her and was considered to be a shy, sweet, and thoughtful person, she always had issues with lacking confidence and self-esteem and felt trapped in her marriage. Things reached the point where the couple's relationship was so unhappy that they were sleeping in separate bedrooms. Even though Ron liked to project a public image of being a wealthy man, he was known for being very cheap when it came to buying stuff for his own family. In fact, his son would recall more than one birthday where his father literally told him, quote, "The cake's your present." But Sharon eventually reached her breaking point after a number of warning signs. About a month before she disappeared, Ron told Sharon that he wanted her to hand over her retirement account, which was valued at around $30,000, but she refused to do so. Ron often told Sharon that she was mentally ill, and she would tell one of her friends that she came across some papers which suggested that her husband was planning to have her committed to a psychiatric hospital. Finally, on June the 11th, Sharon contacted an attorney and officially filed for divorce from Ron. According to her friends and family, Sharon seemed a lot more serious about this decision than the first time she attempted to leave Ron back in 1985, and had been waiting to go through with it until both her children started university. Sharon's attorney obtained a temporary restraining order which barred any movement with the couple's assets until a hearing could be held the following week. Sharon was planning to request sole possession of their home, which would force Ron to move out, but her attorney advised her to remain in the house until the divorce could go through. Sharon also sought control of more than half of their family's assets, alleging that Ron had a history of having committed quote-unquote fraud on the community. Even though Ron was not officially served with the divorce papers, Sharon did warn him they were coming, which reportedly caused him to threaten her. She contacted a number of relatives and friends, asking them to frequently check in on her to ensure her safety, and she even asked one friend to vouch for her in divorce court because she suspected that Ron would accuse her of being mentally ill. Since Autumn was still living at home, Sharon asked her daughter to stay close to her until the divorce was finalized and not leave her alone with Ron. Naturally, since Sharon went missing only 2 days after she filed for divorce, this created a number of red flags, and investigators were anxious to speak with Ron. After dodging them for 3 weeks, Ron finally agreed to an interview which would take place at his house. When investigators arrived, Ron did not answer the door, so they spoke to a neighbor who assured them that Ron was home. This prompted them to wait outside in their car for 2.5 hours before Ron finally emerged and let them inside the house. While Ron's interview was taking place, he ran his own tape recorder to document the conversation. Even though Autumn had told the police that Ron was attending a breakfast business meeting on the morning Sharon disappeared, he never shared any specific details about this so-called meeting or make any attempt to provide an alibi. Ron expressed his belief that Sharon had taken off voluntarily and gone to Lake Tahoe, a place she had always wanted to visit, but nothing was ever found to substantiate this. Ron also claimed that Sharon had taken over $10,000 in cash, which they had been keeping inside the house, but when investigators asked him to show them where the money had been stored, he refused. Over time, Ron would provide a number of different explanations to explain Sharon's disappearance, including that she was involved with drugs, she wandered off after suffering a psychotic episode, or she had voluntarily checked into a mental institution. In spite of Ron's numerous claims about his wife's instability, there was no evidence that she ever suffered from any form of mental illness. While Ron would tell people that he hired his own private investigator to search for Sharon, no one believed him. Even though Sharon had gone missing, numerous attempts would still be made to serve Ron with the divorce papers over the next several months, but he always avoided them, and even went to the trouble of installing a surveillance camera outside his house. In September of that year, Ronnie, who was still living in a dorm on campus, decided to drive to his family's home in order to confront his father and demand to know what happened to Sharon. When he arrived, Ron asked his son if he was wearing a wire, prompting Ronnie to remove his shirt to prove that he wasn't. Ron then told Ronnie that his mother was in a mental hospital, but offered no proof to support this claim. A heated conversation broke out, which prompted Ron to go grab a gun and point it at his son. Ronnie immediately fled the house and started driving away, but then remembered that he had left his cell phone behind and considered the idea of using his phone to secretly record a conversation. So Ronnie went into the front yard and convinced his father to exit the house, but Ron told him that he had crossed the line, and in a threatening manner, informed Ronnie that he was going to send someone to talk to him at his dorm within the next few days. Ronnie went to the authorities and filed a felony assault charge against Ron, but a grand jury ultimately decided not to indict him. Ronnie and Autumn would eventually stop speaking with their father and have never hesitated to express their belief that he may have been responsible for what happened to their mother. Anyway, the case eventually captured the attention of Unsolved Mysteries, who would film and produce an entire segment about Sharon's disappearance. While Ron was contacted about doing an on-camera interview, he declined to do so. The segment was scheduled to air during the spring of 2002, but plans were halted when Ron sent the producers of the show an accusatory letter. In the end, the segment did not run on television and has never seen the light of day. When Thomas Korosek wrote an extensive article about the case in the Dallas Observer in July of that year, Ron also declined his request for an interview. Instead, Ron sent the paper a letter outlining his reasons for not participating, expressing his belief that the article would be one-sided, and stating that the Observer had a quote-unquote unhealthy history and fascination with African-American men and will do anything to write a negative story about them. He continued to maintain that Sharon took off voluntarily and wrote, quote, "The most logical explanation for not contacting our children is that she is not taking her daily medication," end quote. In April of 2003, Ron made the news again when he appeared in small claims court as part of a lawsuit he filed against an attorney named Cheryl Watley. Ron had actually hired Watley just over a week after Sharon went missing, but she stopped representing him about a year later. However, Ron soon decided to file suit against Watley, alleging that she owed him a partial refund of a $10,000 retainer he had paid her. Well, since they were now on opposing sides in a court battle, the attorney-client privilege they once had would be stripped away, so Watley was under no obligation to remain silent about anything Ron said to her. At the civil trial, Watley testified that Ron expressed his concern that his wife's disappearance might lead to other investigations over his alleged involvement in tax evasion and money laundering. She said that one of her duties was making it appear like Ron was cooperating with the police, even though he was not. For example, when investigators asked Ron to take a polygraph, she told them he would, but only if he received the questions in advance. Of course, they did not agree to this, and the polygraph never took place, but now Ron could technically say that he never refused the request. Watley also claimed that Ron told her to do a television interview in which she painted Sharon as mentally ill or a drug addict, but she refused to do so. During his closing argument, Watley's attorney practically accused Ron of killing his wife, telling the jury, quote, "The fact is that if he hadn't paid Miss Watley, he might be in prison today instead of in a suit," end quote. Instead of retaining the services of another attorney, Ron elected to represent himself at the trial, but he did not endear himself to the jury, who ruled in Watley's favor and awarded her $1,558 in damages. But in spite of this newfound attention which was brought to the case, the investigation remained at a standstill. There have been no further developments within the past 2 decades, and Sharon Davis continues to remain a missing person. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Wow, so unlike many of the other cases I've covered on this podcast, I didn't really know anything about this one beforehand, so when I started researching it, I went in completely blind, not knowing what to expect. It's not often that I'm left completely speechless by some of the information I find, but that happened a couple of times in this case. I featured a number of stories about women who went missing, and their husband was suspected of murdering them, but I think that many of those husbands, including the infamous Jewel Kaler, would even look at Ron Davis and say, "Dude, stop being such a jerk." As you've probably already surmised, I would hardly call this case a whodunit, and it seems pretty obvious what happened, but there's still a number of interesting things to talk about here. Like I mentioned in the intro, I know of quite a few cases from Unsolved Mysteries which generated controversy and only aired on television once or a handful of times, but this is the only occurrence I know of where the show went to the trouble of producing a segment, but then decided not to air it at all. The closest example of this I can think of was the story of Thomas Drake, which was going to be featured on their short-lived spin-off series, Final Appeal, from the files of Unsolved Mysteries, but the episode got preempted, and the series wound up being cancelled before they got a chance to re-air it. But at least in that case, they wound up airing a repackaged version of the segment on the Dennis Farina-hosted reboot of Unsolved Mysteries, which ran on Spike TV several years later. As far as I know, the Sharon Davis segment is still sitting in a vault somewhere, and I have my doubts that it will ever see the light of day. The circumstances of why they made that decision are a bit murky, but I get the impression that the accusatory letter Ron Davis sent to the show played a role in their decision not to air the segment. In that Dallas Observer article I referenced, an Unsolved Mysteries producer was asked for comment, and she implied that the case was too hot for an entertainment show to handle, stating, quote, "For various reasons, we came up against numerous roadblocks. We're not 60 Minutes, end quote. Of course, the ironic thing is that Unsolved Mysteries featured a ton of cases in which someone was murdered or went missing, and their spouse was suspected of being involved, but a surprising number of these people were willing to be interviewed on the show in order to defend themselves, and most of the time, they did a piss-poor job at it and came across as unbelievable and unlikable. I think a lot of those people were either dumb or narcissistic enough to think that if they appeared on camera maintaining their innocence, people would believe them. Ron Davis wasn't willing to do that, which would make sense under normal circumstances, but the weird part is that he did a number of other incredibly stupid things which could have led to his downfall, such as suing his own attorney and taking her to small claims court. When you hear that Ron was brazen enough to do that, then I have to wonder if he sent some sort of legal threat to Unsolved Mysteries to compel them not to air the segment. But filing a civil suit against his attorney could have backfired in a huge way, as I'm not sure that Ron even realized that this sort of thing would negate attorney-client privilege, and that anything he said to her in confidence could now go on the public record. And what's particularly mind-blowing is that Ron went through all this for the purpose of attaining only a couple of $1,000s he felt he was owed. Not only that, but he elected to represent himself in court, though I doubt many attorneys would be lining up to represent a client who liked to sue his own attorneys. While all this was going on, some people probably believed that Ron was on a self-destructive path and almost wanted to get caught, which would soon lead to him doing something stupid to break the case wide open. Yet after the episode in Small Claims Court, the media coverage about Sharon's disappearance just seemed to grind to a halt, and I haven't found any articles published about her since 2003. Given that he has a very common name, I can't even verify if Ron Davis is still alive today, but if he is, he would be in his mid-70s by now. And a lot of these disappearances, it's always heartbreaking when someone is suspected of murdering their spouse and winds up getting custody of their children. They usually wind up keeping the kids away from the victim side of the family and brainwash them into believing they're innocent, but Ronnie and Autumn Davis were college-aged adults when their mother went missing, and they saw right through their father's claims about her. I feel terrible for Ronnie and Autumn because they essentially lost both of their parents, and I would not be surprised if they are still no longer speaking with Ron. And that's definitely understandable, since he did not treat them particularly well, and flat out pulled a gun on his own son when he confronted him about his mother's disappearances. So I definitely hope they're both living happy, stable lives today. And then there's Sharon, who was by all accounts a very kind, generous person who treated everybody well, but was trapped in an unhappy marriage. I get the impression that she wanted to wait until her children were grown up and attending university before she actually went through the process of divorcing Ron, which happens sometimes in broken marriages, where the couple will remain living in the same house together for their children's sake, but no longer have any feelings of love or intimacy towards each other. Obviously, it cannot be a coincidence that Sharon just happened to go missing only 2 days after she officially filed for divorce. And it's pretty damning that Ron seemed to care much more about attacking her character, alleging that she was mentally ill or on drugs, rather than showing any genuine concern for her safety. It's obvious that Ron had a motive to kill Sharon, but it may have even stemmed from something more than feelings of anger and betrayal. As you recall, Sharon wanted to control a good chunk of the family's assets, and flat out accused Ron of committing fraud in the divorce papers. I have a feeling that if Ron had not given Sharon everything she wanted, and decided to take her to court for a heated legal battle, some pretty unsavory things about him would have emerged. So in case you didn't already have enough reasons to dislike Ron, here is some background on his employment history. After moving to Dallas, Ron spent many years working as a code enforcement supervisor, but in 1992, he went to the police and filed a report, alleging that he was the victim of a mugging while leaving his office. He subsequently filed a disability lawsuit against the city and sought $1.2 million in damages, claiming that the attack had left him, quote-unquote, psychologically impaired and unable to work. Well, there was immediate suspicion that this was a ruse, as Ron had been passed over for promotion at his job and decided to file a grievance against the city, but he wound up losing that only 6 weeks before the alleged mugging. While Ron's children and many other people would later say that he always appeared to be healthy and able-bodied, and when he underwent psychological evaluations, they didn't seem to show anything wrong with him. Nevertheless, Ron's disability suit would drag on for 5 years, until the city's attorneys inexplicably stopped filing motions, which led to Ron being awarded all the back pay he missed during that time period. In the meantime, Ron had used his time away from his job to become a political and community activist, and was elected to the executive board of the Dallas branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, aka the NAACP. But in 1999, NAACP officials suspended Ron, the current NAACP president, and the Dallas County Commissioner because of some irregularities which took place in a local association election. So Ron responded by incorporating a new chapter of the NAACP, which he ran out of his home, and he would be joined by other people who had been suspended by the organization. Ron also started the Dallas Economic Development Corporation, a nonprofit and tax-exempt organization that provided shelter and other services to low-income individuals in order to support their mission of, quote-unquote, elevating the economic status of poor people. Since Ron had technically not held down a regular job since 1992, his children would later say they were unsure how exactly he was generating any income, but he told them that he worked as a private financial advisor and traded stocks to make money. Oh, and in case you didn't think Ron was a big enough douchebag, here's another lovely story about him. After his mother died in 1996, there was a dispute between Ron and his siblings over allegations that he had improperly influenced her to leave him her six-figure inheritance. Things escalated to the point where Ron actually sued his own sister for $15,000 in federal court, though the suit would be tossed out by a judge who wrote, quote, "This action involves a family squabble that has become quite literally a federal case," end quote. Anyway, in spite of all the controversy surrounding him, it seems like Ron's work as an activist had connected him to a number of powerful and influential people. In spite of the publicity surrounding Sharon's disappearance, the Dallas County Commissioners would appoint Ron to a 3-member commission in charge of overseeing labor matters at the Dallas County Sheriff's Department. This happened to occur around the same time that Unsolved Mysteries was planning to air their segment about the case, so I wonder if this gave Ron enough pull to convince them to drop it. Anyway, throughout all this, it sounds like Sharon remained an honest, hardworking woman who kept trying to better herself and was planning to become a school principal, but Ron still made her pay half of the household expenses. Even though Ron was never charged with any fraudulent activities, it would not surprise me in the least if he was involved in something shady, particularly since he told his own attorney that he feared Sharon's disappearance might lead to separate investigations involving tax evasion and money laundering. I get the impression that something might have been off with Ron's Dallas Economic Development Corporation, as Ron used it to pay himself a salary of $29,000 per year, and tax forms showed that he listed his brother, who was living in Milwaukee, as a company officer, and his daughter from his previous marriage, who was living in California, as the president. Even stranger, Sharon was also listed as an officer on the forms under her maiden name, Sharon Ware. If this corporation was a front for something, then you have to wonder if Sharon knew about it and could have potentially exposed this information, along with many other things, during the divorce proceedings. You might recall the episode I did about the unsolved disappearance of Michelle Harris, which happened to take place only 3 months after this one. Michelle also went missing while in the midst of a heated divorce with her husband, and much like with Sharon's case, Michelle was advised by her attorney to remain living in the same house with her estranged husband until the divorce was finalized because it would increase her chances of getting the property during the settlement. But unfortunately, this may have ultimately led to her getting killed. Sharon obviously feared the worst, which is why she advised her friends and family to check in on her for her safety. And since her daughter was still living at home, Sharon asked Autumn to make sure she was never alone with Ron. For this reason, I think Ron came up with a calculated plan to ensure he could get rid of Sharon while their daughter was away. We know that the last confirmed sighting of Sharon is when she dropped Autumn off at a bus depot for the Dallas Area Rapid Transit System, aka the DART. And incidentally, this is creepily reminiscent of the aforementioned Unsolved Mysteries case about the disappearance of Dottie Kaler, who went missing after her estranged husband, Jewel Kaler, claimed he dropped her off at a train station for the Bay Area Rapid Transit System, aka the BART. But unlike that case, we do know for certain that Sharon was actually at the DART station that morning, but something obviously happened to her afterward. According to Autumn, Sharon was dressed in a nightgown and jogging pants and still had curlers in her hair when she drove her there, which is why she was planning to go back home and change clothes before she headed to a training session at her school later that morning. Since Sharon never showed up for that session, the obvious explanation is that she was killed after arriving back at her house, and whoever was responsible disposed of her body. But here's the interesting part. Autumn maintained that her father was not at the house when she woke up at 6:30 a.m., and had still not returned by the time her mother drove her to the DART station. It's certainly plausible that Ron could have returned to the house around the same time Sharon did and killed her, but where was he during those early morning hours? Well, Autumn says her mother told her that Ron had to leave early to attend some sort of breakfast meeting, but she thought it was very out of character for him to conduct business at that time of the morning. Since Ron refused to share any specific details about this alleged meeting when he was interviewed by police, I think it's safe to assume that it never happened. Given that Sharon was being extra cautious not to be alone with Ron, I think it's safe to assume that if he was at the house that morning, Sharon would have gotten completely ready before driving Autumn to the DART station and then heading straight to school. But since she believed Ron was away at a meeting, she probably figured it was safe to return home and get changed. Given how controlling Ron was, it's reasonable to assume he was familiar with Sharon's ordinary morning routine. This may have been a calculated attempt by Ron to give Sharon a false sense of security so he could corner her alone at the house. This also may have been Ron's attempt to fabricate an alibi for himself. I'm getting flashbacks to the episode I did a few months ago about the unsolved murder of Mary Lou Girai. In that case, Mary Lou was shot to death inside her own home after her husband, Stephen Girai, supposedly left at around 6:30 a.m., even though it was standard practice for him not to leave until hours later. Some people suspect that he was fabricating an alibi because he either killed Mary Lou before he left, or he hired someone else to enter the house and kill Mary Lou while he wasn't there. Of course, the key difference between these two cases is that Stephen Gerai made sure to provide a meticulous minute-by-minute account of all his movements during the time period after he left the house, whereas Ron didn't even try. I actually can't completely discount the idea that Ron could have hired someone to get rid of Sharon rather than do it himself. I'm sure it was a calculated move to abandon Sharon's minivan at a Bally Total Fitness club she was known to frequent, but you have to wonder when exactly it was placed there. While the van wasn't discovered until 5 days later, employees were certain they saw it in the parking lot sometime after midnight on June the 14th. We know that Autumn eventually came home from work and saw her father at the house that night, but I'm assuming that the van was not there. So even if Ron drove it to the fitness club after Autumn went to sleep, where exactly was the van hiding during this time period? Well, what if someone else planted it there? I do find it curious that Ron mentioned his wife taking over $10,000 in cash from the house when she disappeared, but when police asked if they could search the location where this cash had supposedly been stored, his response was, quote, "That's none of your business." Their rationale was that if Sharon's disappearance was the result of a robbery and the perpetrator forced her to take them to this hidden money, they could have left fingerprints or other evidence behind, but Ron was unreceptive to this idea. If Ron arranged for someone to murder Sharon, dispose of her body, and abandon the minivan at Bally Fitness, he could have used this $10,000 to pay them off, and came up with a cover story about Sharon taking it in order to explain why it went missing. But overall, I think the simpler explanation is that Ron killed her himself. If he had hired someone to do it while he was at another location, Ron probably would have taken steps to come up with a much stronger alibi for himself, but he made no attempt whatsoever to account for his whereabouts during the time period Sharon went missing. Remember, Ron never pushed forward the narrative that someone else murdered Sharon. He wanted to make everyone believe she took off voluntarily or suffered some sort of mental breakdown, but no one believed that. It's the same rationale in virtually every other case in which a mother goes missing. Even if they were unhappy about their relationship with their spouse, there's no way she would have abandoned her children. Unfortunately, I think one of the reasons Ron acted so brazen and arrogant about the disappearance of his wife, and has never attempted to show any empathy towards her, is because he seems to have done a very thorough job at covering his tracks. So he probably figures that without a body or any other damning physical evidence, there's very little chance of him being caught. And of course, one of the biggest tragedies of this case is that aside from a couple of extensive articles in the Dallas Observer in 2002 and 2003, there has hardly been any media coverage of Sharon's disappearance over the past 2 decades. I can't help but think that if this exact series of events had taken place with a white suburban couple, the story would have gotten a lot more exposure. I know there's zero chance of this happening, but it would be great if the original Unsolved Mysteries segment could be released from their vault and shown on Amazon Prime or YouTube, because this case needs all the attention it can get. I have no idea if Ron is still alive today, or if there's any chance of him facing justice, but at the very least, Sharon's son and daughter deserve answers about what happened to her. So if you happen to have any information about the disappearance of Sharon Davis, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, we covered the bizarre saga of Julie Mott, a young woman who died of cystic fibrosis before her body was stolen from her casket at a funeral home, and it has still not been found. And for our patrons in tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to take a moment to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Sherry H., Brittany B., Jeff H., Suzanne R., Stephen M., Indy Republican, Renee F., Marissa B., Montana H., and Fuvar. Thank you all so much for your support. And before I bring this episode to a close, I would like to play a promo for another true crime podcast, True Crime Horror Story.
I am your host, JD Horror, and this is True Crime Horror Story, a true crime podcast designed like an anthology horror movie. It's definitely not for the faint of heart, and it's not played for laughs. Join us on January 30th, 2020 for the debut of Season 2. If you thought Season 1 was extreme, get ready, because you haven't heard anything yet. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Subscribe now wherever podcasts can be consumed, and check out our website, www.truecrimehorrorstory.com. True Crime Horror Story. Sometimes truth is more brutal than fiction.
I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. Need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So have yourselves a great week, and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.